How do you deal with that and explaining that to MSPs when they come to you with that alphabet soup control issue?
Yeah, I think you made this analogy once, but you referred to CyberVerify as the Rosetta Stone of the compliance languages. So if we think about that as the MSP maintains that master control, they have the Rosetta Stone. So if they've got a client in the healthcare space that has to maintain their HIPAA compliance or they go through a high trust audit each year, that control is translated for that healthcare client. They got a banking client that needs that SOC 2 flavor of translation, then they go there. If they've got a manufacturing client that needs the ISO flavor of translation, then it translates that way, all going back to that control that's managed and maintained by their MSP.
Welcome, Chris and Kyle from MSP Alliance. Appreciate you guys hopping on to the MSPZone. We're going to talk about a topic that I know you guys get a ton of questions from different perspectives. Kyle, you more on the sales side, and Chris, you more on the service compliance side. But they all blend in together, which is governance, risk, compliance, GRC for short, and GRC tools or technologies. And we're going to talk about the history of GRC. We're going to talk about where they came from, what they are doing now, what they're trying to do now. We're going to talk about whether or not MSP businesses need a GRC to do compliance or to achieve certification outcomes or to improve internal security. There's a lot of questions that we get a lot of. So we're going to do this podcast to kind of address, hopefully, a large component of those questions and topics, and give you some really good solid answers, give you at least some good advice about how you should maybe move forward. So Chris, Kyle, welcome to the podcast again. Let's get to it, shall we?
Let's do it.
Thanks, Charles. Sounds good.
Okay. By way of background, GRC tools are not new. GRC tools have been around for decades. I mean, as long as MSP Alliance has been around, I'm familiar with GRC tools that have existed, but they largely came from the enterprise space, and they were I would say exclusively aimed at internal compliance officers. That is to say, people who understood compliance, they knew what their company needed to accomplish, and a GRC tool was a necessary documentation platform, basically. Chris, first of all, is that your understanding of GRC? Is that kind of where you see that platform type coming from?
Yes, the enterprise industry level with a mix of risk assessment and governance, and ultimately driving your compliance through those two metrics.
Today, we are seeing a new breed or new class, if you will, of GRC tools that are not exclusively enterprise, meaning they still sell to the enterprise and a little bit to the mid-market, but they're really trying to go into the SMB market. And a curious thing has happened, which is that my opinion, but maybe Kyle, you can talk about this because you probably have a lot of experience with this, is that the GRCs are looking at MSPs almost like resellers, and they don't look at the MSP as a target consumer. They look at the MSP as an influencer, if you will. Your quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great take on that. Looking at the MSP as a way to resell more GRC products, increase revenue, which they do a great job at that. I'm not trying to knock them, but I think a better approach is partnering with the MSP, helping them develop a program, helping them to empower their clients, help them be more secure, not just, make an extra buck at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that brings up not a new concept, which is most MSPs that I know of don't want to be looked at as reseller, right? They don't like to be looked at in that way. They look at themselves as a very strategic partner for the vendors that they choose to work with. But GRC tools have kind of put their foot in the door. And Chris, I want to talk about first some observations, which are technical observations that we have seen where MSPs who have used GRC tools. And I'll say maybe that's a good question for you, Chris, is are you seeing more use of GRC tools by MSPs for internal use, or are you seeing more GRC tools used by MSPs for customer use?
Question. So the internal use is, I think they're when they talk to me and they ask me about GRC tools and which ones they recommend or which ones they should be using, that target audience is for their internal compliance. And then after they get comfortable or after they have a sort of top level understanding of their own internal compliance, then they start having, I think they always have these conversations from their customers about using the MSP to deliver compliance to them, the customer. But the MSP they're only using the GRC tool for internal compliance at first.
Yeah. So now all this is in the context of, for those of you who know, for MSP Alliance for 20 plus years has been certifying MSPs throughout the world. We do not look at ourselves as a GRC. We are firmly focused as an MSP compliance program and platform. That is what we are solely focused on. We don't sell to the enterprise. We're not, unless they're an enterprise MSP, of course. But that should, just for everyone's edification, that we are not positioning ourselves, nor have we ever looked at ourselves as GRC. But I want to talk about maybe the MSP that comes to us, they get certified, and then they start using a GRC tool, maybe just to play around with it. We've got some good information now about how those tools actually are used. And Chris, you mentioned something that you saw not that long ago, which is an observation of increased exceptions. And I thought that was like the opposite that I would expect from that class of tool. Could you maybe just talk about what that observation meant and a little bit more around that?
Yes. So the GRC tool is a one size fits all. And so the proper scoping that comes with an MSP compliance framework is essential in eliminating that noise, that GRC noise that you're undoubtedly going to get when you start integrating tools that fire off notifications. So opening up the door to having a notification storm of compliance tasks to do without the proper scoping of what's in and out of scope in terms of delivering your managed services is going to increase visibility into those red bubbles on the screen, and the auditors are going to start digging deeper and deeper in areas that are potentially out of scope for an MSP.
So I'm an MSP, I'm using a GRC, and I think that it's saving me time, right? I bought into this notion that all these APIs, they're firing off all these alerts, and I'm awesome. I'm living the good life. I'm going to be compliant. And then the opposite happens. I've got a whole bunch of non-compliant wildfires. I'm going to call them, like brush fire, and they start spouting up all over the place. That has got to do something in terms of the bandwidth and just the internal resources of the MSP, or worse still, if the MSP is doing it for their customer, there's gonna be a lot of, like you said, noise. How does a typical MSP deal with that? I mean, that can't be a good impact.
Yeah, that's a question we're still trying to answer with delegating the roles and the responsibilities of who should be in charge of compliance controls and sorting out the peoples and the process and the tools against your compliance needs. And so I think if you're an experienced executive in the MSP, then you're going to be able to sift through what's necessary or what's not necessary. If you're getting tasks delegated to you by your service managers or your CISO, then it's very likely that you're not going to know which ones to chase down.
Yeah. I mean, there's just like not that many MSPs with internal compliance departments. I mean, we certify a good number of them, and even those are very few and far between at the mid-market and below level SMB. It's practically non-existent. Kyle, when you feel the call and someone, an MSP comes to you and they're interested in compliance, are they bringing baggage of the GRC to you, or are they bringing it up as an unknown or something that they're unsure about whether they should use?
Yeah, there's been a few instances of the baggage of the GRC, but I think more often than not, it's more just the complexity of the compliance landscape, not sure, not knowing what standard to pick, not knowing how to help their clients, not knowing about, managed controls and shared responsibility matrix and all this different compliance jargon, and just trying to learn all the finer details that pertain to the compliance world and adding that on top of their, already busy schedule, helping their managed services clients.
So, Chris, I mean, one of the things that we, very, very different with us and our approach is, and because again, we're not a GRC aimed at the entire breadth of the global corporate, world. We're an MSP first framework. We have a control framework that is designed exclusively for MSPs. That eliminates some huge decisions right off the bat, right? They're not going into this with a framework, buffet. They come in with maybe I want to achieve a certain, like a SOC 2 or an ISO, but they come in saying, start with my MSP controls first. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The MSP specific framework of the UCS is going to be it's a ladder to the other frameworks in terms of where you start as an MSP. You can climb up the rings to get to SOC 2 and to ISO and to CMMC and some of the more sensitive technical frameworks. But what it does is it has a sturdy base that allows you to understand what's necessary when it comes to actually demonstrating compliance and efficiently delivering your managed services to the customer in the most secure and available way. Yeah, so that UCS is different from the buffet of frameworks that you said, in the sense that it is scoped specifically to the needs of your MSPs and your cloud service providers.
And for the record, I mean, we have an API. We're developing more APIs, so we're not anti-API. It's not the issue. The issue is the uncontrolled broad use of an API that lets in all this information and triggers a bunch of tasks. That is really the core issue, as I understand the exception issue. Is that right?
That's right.
Yes. So taking the approach of an MSP first framework, it also deals with another issue, which is improperly or ill-defined controls. Which is you have a lot of MSPs from all over the world, right, who start with a customer. And Kyle, this may be a question for you. You're dealing with an MSP from Australia, and they're governed largely by Essential 8, right, or the UK with the Cyber Essentials. Or maybe they're from South Africa, or maybe from Brazil or Dominican Republic, where they're more flavored towards ISO 27001. Or maybe they're from Toronto or New York or Dallas, where they're, maybe more sensitive to CIS or SOC 2, right? I've just mentioned a half a dozen different frameworks, but all originating from an MSP who's trying to deal with a customer solution. The ill-defined control issue, to Chris's earlier point, is largely resolved. How do you deal with that and explaining that to MSPs when they come to you with that alphabet soup control issue?
Yeah, I think you made this analogy once, but you referred to CyberVerify as the Rosetta Stone of the compliance languages. So if we think about that as the MSP maintains that master control, they have the Rosetta Stone. So if they've got a client in the healthcare space that has to maintain their HIPAA compliance, or they go through a high trust audit each year, that control is translated for that healthcare client. They got a banking client that needs that SOC 2 flavor of translation, then they go there. If they've got a manufacturing client that needs the ISO flavor of translation, then it translates that way, all going back to that control that's managed and maintained by their MSP.
Chris, most MSPs, would you agree, are not compliance experts? I mean, that goes without saying, right?
I think so. They think, well, one thing I would say is that they probably are experts in compliance as an MSP. They're doing the things that an MSP needs to do to be compliant, but laying the topography of the framework language, which is redundant and confusing and sometimes misleading, is where that MSP specific framework is gonna help translate.
Yeah, not taking away from the technical and business experience and knowledge and expertise that in my opinion, vast majority of MSPs possess. I'm talking about writing a control. Writing a control is a very niche skill set, and not that many people do it, and very, very few people do it really well. Maybe talk about the approach of Cyber Verify as compared to what a GRC would not do for an MSP, which is start to help write that control. Because that seems to be like, if you can't figure out and arrive at quickly what your internal MSP controls are, you're not going to go anywhere, very quickly at all.
Okay. Take a specific example that I like to think about a lot because it's a changing environment, but the disclosure of access when it comes to using third-party tools. As an MSP, you're absolutely going to be using third-party external service providers, and in some instances may even be referred to as an external service provider by your customer, depending on which language you're looking at, whether it's CMMC, the NIST, or the SOC 2 framework. But when you're going through the UCS track, your requirement or the specific language that we want to do is start to disclose that external service provider access through the form of a contract or a master service agreement. And so beginning to write out controls that say, well, we can disclose our service provider access or our service provider use in a contract, but also we can follow a best practice that is to just have it on our website. So whether or not you're on the European continent or the North American continent, that language is universal in the sense that you're telling your customers, here's where your data is stored inside the external service providers through the use of the control writing, and you're doing it in an efficient way. That is, you're going to get lost in translation if you're just doing disclosure statements and sending redundant emails to clients because maybe a tool recommended that's the way you should do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up, Kyle, I think Chris is bringing up a huge point, which I know we've seen before, which is the writing of the control, right? What is it that you do as an MSP? And then how do you write that thing that you do, that process, that kind of very specific step? How do you write that as a control? And then what's the guidance that you are getting as an MSP to refine that process, right? There's a art form to not just writing and articulating the control, but also to why is it important? Because a lot of MSPs don't even understand why, to Chris's point, a disclosure of their third-party vendors has to be made. They say, well, why does that matter? My customers aren't asking me for that. They didn't read a control framework or a law that says, hey, you do have to disclose it, right? It's an actual component, a regulatory or a legal component. Kyle, when you have seen MSPs, maybe, and it doesn't happen a lot, but they use us and maybe they dabbled in a GRC tool and they've come back. It seems to me that a lot of that reason to come back is the guidance was just not there. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. The feedback I've gotten, the guidance is there, but the guidance isn't what they needed. It's not MSP specific guidance. So a lot of the guidance comes with having to take additional time to explain to whoever's providing that guidance, whether it be an auditor or a GRC representative, that no, we do it this way because we're a managed service provider. We have a unique one-to-many business model. This is, best practice in our niche part of the world, and taking the time to explain that to those folks is not a best use of the MSP's time. We've already talked about how valuable their time is. So just having that finely tuned MSP guidance and advice for every single requirement is really a game changer, in my opinion.
I can see how remote access, right, which is it's a popular technology, but it's not like an internal IT department is going to have anything close to the same proficiency in remote access technologies as an MSP would, especially when you add in multi-tenancy and high levels of need for security and privacy in the use of that technology. Very different for an MSP, right? And therefore the control and the guidance has to be really different in getting that MSP through.
Yeah, that's a good point. To add on to the ill-defined control component there with that MSP specific language, right? If we're taking in terms of the ill-defined controls and shoving everybody into the GRC box for lack of a better expression, then the pillars of that box are going to be the confidentiality, availability, and security. Whereas looking at an MSP, although those pillars are necessary, it doesn't include things like the trust component and the transparency components and the expertise component that you are bringing to you, so that hey, we're not going to do this by customer request, because if we get flooded with a bunch of customer requests, that's going to drag down our hours in terms of inefficiency. Instead, we're going to write the control efficiently, so that way we're not getting killed by compliance tasks on the tool.
Right. And because we're going to get to compliance as a service in a moment, but because that, I think, Chris, is an excellent point that speaks to the scalability of a program. And if you're chasing compliance brush fires every single day because a tool that you're using is needlessly setting fire to your ranch, whatever that metaphor is headed to, but it's not going to be a good position to scale that up when you start servicing your customers. But I want to talk, before we get to compliance as a service, I want to talk about the results of going into a non-MSP framework, going into a tool that is setting off little brush fires of go chase this, because they're when I say brush fire, Chris, you want to talk a little bit more about what we mean by either out of scope or ill-defined, and therefore they're not really directly relevant, because that's a kind of an art form of what you do and our team does, but I don't think a lot of people actually understand how that works.
Okay, well, let's take the RMM tool, for example, which is a connecting tool that you can manage customer systems remotely. As an MSP, you know that some of your customers have Windows updates that they need to push out, and they only log onto their computer once in a blue moon because they're busy doing their jobs off the computer. And so that is going to cause the RMM tool to backlog a bunch of notifications that you're aware of if it's a system that hasn't been updated in a while because they're running a legacy software on it. They haven't upgraded that software. The MSP, you're doing your due diligence and pressing them and telling them the need, but we know the business climate out there, which is, I'm going to get it done at the cheapest possible price. That's going to cause a notification inside the tool, if it's integrated with the RMM, where the technician or the practitioner's already dealt with that. They've already risk mitigated that in their own internal compliance, in their own internal tool. So having to do it 2 or 3 different times in 3 different tools because it's triggering a notification is sort of redundant. Depending on who's working in that machine. Just chasing that brush fire, chasing down a Windows 7 update. The engineer already knows that that's there, right? So that the lowest denominator is doing that. The practitioner that work there is just causing an echo chamber of notifications back and forth.
Now, follow-up question. I know it doesn't happen with our program, or if it does, I haven't heard of it, but that scenario you just described has got to have an impact, or could have a very serious impact with the auditors. Could you maybe briefly speak about what is the worst case outcome that could happen with that type of uncontrolled setting of brush fires, of out of scope controls? Where does that lead to eventually?
Depending on the severity of the control and your compensating controls built in, whether or not you're using compensating controls, the auditor's opinion could ultimately be affected, depending on what gets triggered.
And for those of you who are not familiar with auditor speak, that would be you failed the test, right?
That would be you failed the test.
Opinion.
That would be it. It would be bad.
Because these GRC tools largely, again, and we're trying really not to knock GRCs, but we're trying to also explain what the reality is. And the reality is, if you have a non-compliance person using a GRC tool, then they're not going to know why that GRC tool communicating a bunch of those failed, those exceptions to controls that should not have been in there or could have been dealt with more effectively, then go to the auditor, and the auditor says, wow, you got a lot of messy stuff here. This is really bad. You're a risky company. Fail. Right. So it's partially the GRC tool setting up this environment, and then that information goes to the auditor, and the auditor doesn't know any different, I'm assuming, right? The auditor just takes it and goes with it.
The auditor does auditing, right? And so what is entailed in auditing, depending on your auditor, they may just be racking up hours, chasing down things that were out of scope in the first place, and they're not going to cut you a discount on that.
Okay. Well, so Kyle, I know you've had this conversation because I've heard you talk about it. Chris's point is that it not only has an adverse opinion, impact on the potential of your audit outcome, but there's a cost component. So can you speak about the cost component in your experience?
Yeah, it goes back to what you were mentioning a moment ago, but I've had an MSP tell me that they went to get a SOC 2 Type 1, I believe it was. They had an agreement with the auditor. Here's how much it's going to cost. But somewhere in the fine print, there was billable hours mentioned. And at the end of the engagement, well, actually, before they even got to the end of the engagement, because they didn't end up finishing, but the billable hours had racked up to double the cost of what the SOC 2 was initially estimated as. And they didn't end up getting the SOC 2. So it was kind of a double burn, unfortunately.
This was so this was a GRC tool and then an auditor, or was it just an auditor we're using a GRC tool?
I would have to double check. I don't know for sure if a GRC was involved or if it was just a local auditor. I don't want to misspeak about that.
Well, there's a lot of auditors out there that will claim to help. Look, auditors have been around for a long time, and not all of them are adopting GRCs, and maybe they're seeing the risk of GRCs. Maybe not. I don't know. But I mean, what you're talking about is the auditor is just, they don't know what an MSP does. And so there's a lot of confusion about how to give them that guidance, it sounds like.
Right. The auditors were billing the MSP for the time it took for the MSP to explain what an MSP is to the auditor.
Sounds like a great business model if you can get paid for it.
Great business model, just printing money.
Okay. So the real question comes down to then, we've talked almost exclusively about the MSP using GRC in their internal environment to obtain certification. And I don't know of any MSP that's just using GRC to become better, because I don't think that that's really what GRC is designed for. But let's talk about compliance. There are a ton of MSPs that are coming in, and Kyle, back to you. Talk to us about the demand now for compliance from a customer, and what is the role of the MSP in 2025 to deal with that demand?
Yeah, I think it's certainly been increasing. Originally, it kind of stemmed from how does the MSP demonstrate that they're a credible, a professional, a stable MSP, to now it's they're a vendor to their client who maybe they haven't been a regulated industry. They need their MSP to be certified, to be professional. It has to go beyond just a word of a mouth engagement. And the MSP needs to be able to demonstrate that for the client, in some cases even to be able to bid on a new client. So that's certainly been increasing, certainly in healthcare and banking and different critical infrastructure, government areas like that.
Yeah, I think it was a matter of time. We picked up during the pandemic, during the lockdowns especially, there's a ton of MSP activity helping their customers with cyber insurance forms, right? Like, I think that was one of the very early scenarios of MSPs dabbling in compliance. But very quickly, Chris turned from help me with an insurance form to I've got to get a SOC 2. Can you help me with this? Chris, can you maybe talk about the role of we call it managed controls, but the role of the MSP in a modern day customer compliance role?
Okay. You're onboarding a client into your managed services, and they tell you that they need two-factor, they need a virtual desktop setup, and they need you to manage their infrastructure from top to bottom, because what they've been doing is just Google Suite, and they signed up for that. And so they grew, and now they realize that efficiency actually is going to save them a lot of money and a lot of time. And so they come to depend on the MSP for providing that services. And all of a sudden now I can't live without you. I need you guys' your services to maintain that efficiency so I can keep doing my job and doing what I do best. And so the MSP now is in the position to not only be an expert on how they provide those services to the client, but also they are an expert in MSP compliance from getting certified year in and year out and obtaining and achieving and then keeping that certification. And so the managed control is a way of saying, you don't need to do this and prove that you're doing this. We do this for you. And we've already been tested by the auditor, and we have a current tested control framework that proves that we're doing this for you as your certified MSP. And so that control can then be relayed to the MSP's customer downstream.
That seems wildly different from a GRC tool approaching an MSP and saying, resell me, sell this technology to a customer. I mean, what you're talking about is like the MSP being, again, deeply embedded, a trusted provider, a trusted partner with that customer, from top to bottom, it sounds like.
Yeah, using the tool as part of the onboarding process for maybe a more mature client that knows the ecosystem that they're working inside of, and being able to demonstrate, listen, if you're getting approached by your customers and you need to demonstrate your cyber compliance, I'm managing 59% of these controls for you already. Why not just take credit for it and only have to prove the other 41?
Yeah, I mean, if I was an MSP, that would be a much better position to be in rather than buy a GRC tool and figure it out yourself, right? And go through the rug burn of the unpleasantness of trying to document those controls, figure out what the control even means, and who governs it, who manages it. I mean, that, why do that all over again?
Yeah,
seems like a bunch of busy work. Yeah. So in closing, I just again, and Colin, maybe I'll get your take and then Chris's, but does an MSP who is achieving Cyber Verify or has achieved it, and that could mean they either have a Cyber Verify by itself or they have it with a SOC 2 or an ISO or any of the other certifications that we offer, is a GRC tool is a GRC tool necessary?
In our experience, it's not necessary, especially if you're utilizing, in the instance that you're using Cyber Verify, it's not necessary. You're able to maintain a state of continuous compliance by staying up to date on the UCS each year, all the updates for all the other relevant frameworks that get pushed out periodically, updated templates, updated policies. So you stay up to date. You're always being reviewed by a team of MSP experts that know MSPs inside and out. So if there's any changes to your organization, maybe you buy another MSP, maybe you're getting bought by another MSP, you're merging two different teams, you're expanding to multiple locations, different countries around the world, you're able to stay in compliance by keeping up with your Cyber Verify and meeting that UCS, those set of requirements each year.
So if a GRC tool is not necessary to achieve that, then it seems to me that there's some cost reduction if they're already dabbling with, and they're not cheap tools, right? Some of these GRC platforms are like very costly, and that's not, we haven't even talked about the cost beyond the license cost and the risk, the having to teach the auditors and all that other stuff. And Chris, to your point, same question, but maybe a little more technical. If MSPs are just housing, they go through Cyber Verify, they have their controls documented for them, they know what they are. Maybe they're using SharePoint or some other server storage system to house their policies and procedures. Do they really need a GRC just to house and organize their documents? Or is that something they could just do with, off the shelf technology they already use?
Off the shelf technology is going to be what they're using. Generally speaking, they probably have an IT documentation tool already. And so if it's synthesizing, I would say if it's synthesizing everything together in a really neat and easy way, then it could certainly help you. If you are just getting started and you have no idea what to do, then it's only going to hurt the efficiency components right off the bat, relying on a out of the box solution that is meant for a much larger organization that has much more manpower to use it.
Yeah, that's good advice. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. But I just think that there's a lot of confusion out there. And there's a lot of people who say, I have to get one of these GRCs because it's going to help me do my compliance in half the time and at half the cost. And I'm just listening to the two of you. It doesn't sound like either of those is reasonable outcome. In fact, it's more likely that it's going to have the opposite effect, not because they're flawed products, but because they weren't built for MSPs, and B, they're built for kind of a different use case, right? That's nothing wrong with that. I was just,
Right.
trying to be realistic, I guess. Yeah. Okay. Well, if you guys have questions, all right, we talked about a lot of different things. If you have questions about GRC tools, should you use them? Should you not use them? If you're using one now and you don't, maybe they're too costly, or they're creating those compliance brush fires that we talked about, and you're wanting to deviate from that, certainly feel free to reach out to our team. Kyle can, walk you through kind of our process and what we do. And gentlemen, just a passing comment. It's not like we don't have MSPs who go through CyberVerify and also have a GRC tool. I mean, I'm pretty sure we have a few of those, right?
Yeah, I know of a few. They've figured out a nice way to get the two to play nicely together. Some of them have a full in-house compliance team dedicated to working with that GRC tool. So they're, of course, are experts at it by now.
Yeah. But it's not a requirement,
right,
by any means. Okay, well, there you have it, right from the horse's mouth. Not that you guys are horses, but we appreciate your input. And like I said, if you have a question about your own compliance journey, and especially if you are not yet walking down the path towards becoming compliant, definitely encourage you to reach out to us, ask questions. You probably have a whole bunch of new questions just by listening to this discussion. And that's what we're here for. But we wanted to share a little bit of our experience and relay the experience of our members to you so that you could benefit from that and ultimately just become a better, safer, more secure, and more stable managed service provider. That's what this is all about. And we wish you all the best. Until next time.